The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Broken Ridge, Montana Territory. The year was 1876, and the frontier town bore all the scars of rapid growth: hastily constructed buildings with unpainted wood facades, muddy streets rutted by countless wagon wheels, and the constant smell of horse manure mixing with the acrid smoke from the blacksmith's forge. Jake McKenna sat on the weathered porch of Murphy's saloon, his worn leather boots propped up on the railing, watching the daily theater of frontier life unfold before him. At 42, Jake had the look of a man who'd seen too much of the world's harsh realities. His face was deeply lined from years under the relentless prairie sun, and his steel-gray eyes held the weariness of someone who'd witnessed more violence than any man should. His brown hair, streaked with premature silver, hung past his collar beneath a battered black hat that had seen better decades. The Colt .45 at his hip wasn't for show. The worn grip and well-oiled holster spoke of a man who knew how to use it and had done so more times than he cared to remember. Jake had drifted into Broken Ridge 3 months ago, like so many others seeking something: gold, land, or simply a place to disappear. Unlike most, he'd stayed, finding work as a ranch hand for the widow Sarah Henderson, whose husband had died in a mining accident the previous winter. The work was honest, the pay fair, and for the first time in years, Jake felt something approaching peace. That peace was about to be shattered. The commotion started at the far end of town, near Morrison's general store. Raised voices carried on the dusty wind, and Jake's instincts, honed by years of survival, immediately went on alert. He swung his boots down from the railing and stood, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun belt. The shouting grew louder, and he could make out individual words now: thief, savage, get out. A crowd was gathering, and Jake could see the unmistakable signs of mob mentality taking hold. Men were picking up stones, sticks, whatever they could find. Women were pulling their children back into doorways, but not before pointing and adding their voices to the growing chorus of anger. In the center of it all, Jake caught a glimpse of someone small and dark-haired, pressed against the wall of the general store. Jake had seen lynch mobs before. He'd seen what happened when fear and anger combined with the anonymity of a crowd. Nothing good ever came of it. He started walking toward the disturbance, his long legs eating up the distance with purposeful strides. As he got closer, the situation became clearer and more disturbing. The target of the mob's anger was a young Native American girl, no more than 12 or 13 years old. She wore a simple buckskin dress decorated with small beads, and her long black hair hung in 2 braids down her back. Her dark eyes were wide with terror, and tears streamed down her face as she pressed herself against the wooden wall of the store, trying to become invisible. "She was stealing bread," shouted Tom Morrison, the store owner, his face red with indignation. "Caught her red-handed, I did. These savages think they can just take whatever they want. Should run her out of town on a rail," called out Bill Hawkins, the town's self-appointed moral authority. "Make an example of her." "Or worse," muttered Sam Crawford, hefting a thick piece of wood. "Show these Indians what happens when they come into our town uninvited." Jake pushed through the crowd, his presence causing men to step aside without conscious thought. There was something about him, maybe the way he carried himself or the cold steel in his eyes, that made people think twice about getting in his way. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger, every step deliberate and controlled. "What's the problem here?" Jake's voice cut through the shouting like a blade. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to him. The girl looked up at him with desperate hope, as if he might be her salvation. Morrison stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "This little savage was stealing from my store. Caught her with bread in her hands, I did. We can't let this sort of thing stand, McKenna. Give 'em an inch, and they'll take a mile." Jake looked at the girl, then at the crowd of angry faces surrounding her. He'd seen this before, the look of people who'd already made up their minds, who were looking for any excuse to unleash their frustrations on someone weaker than themselves. The girl couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds soaking wet, and she was shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. "Did you see her take anything?" Jake asked, his voice level and calm. "Well, She had bread in her hands," Morrison sputtered. "That's not what I asked. Did you see her take it?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Morrison's face grew even redder. "She's an Indian. What more do you need to know?" That was all Jake needed to hear. He'd grown up on stories of the frontier, of cowboys and Indians, of savage attacks and heroic defenses, but he'd also seen enough of the world to know that there were usually two sides to every story, and that the truth was rarely as simple as people wanted it to be. More importantly, he'd seen what happened to the innocent when mobs took justice into their own hands. Jake stepped between the girl and the crowd, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt. The gesture was casual, almost absent-minded, but every man in the crowd noticed it. "Seems to me you're all getting worked up over some bread. How much could it be worth? A few cents." "It's not about the money," Hawkins protested. "It's about the principle. We can't let these savages think they can just—" "She's a child." Jake's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. A hungry child. "Any of you ever been hungry? Really hungry? Hungry enough that you'd risk your life for a piece of bread?" The crowd murmured, some of the anger starting to fade as Jake's words sank in. But not all of them were ready to back down. "She's still a thief," Morrison insisted, "and she's not our problem. Her people should take care of their own." Jake looked at the girl again. Up close, he could see that she wasn't just scared, she was exhausted. Her dress was torn and dirty, and there were scratches on her arms and legs that looked like they'd come from traveling through rough country. She had the look of someone who'd been running for a long time. "What's your name?" Jake asked her gently. The girl looked at him with suspicion, then glanced at the crowd. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, her English heavily accented, but clear. "They call me Little Bird." "Where are your people, Little Bird?" Tears welled up in her eyes again. "Gone. Soldiers came. Many died. I ran." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Indian Wars had been raging for years, with atrocities committed on both sides. But this was just a child, alone and frightened, and these men were ready to string her up over a piece of bread. "Well, there you have it," Jake said, turning back to the crowd. "She's a refugee. Her people are dead or scattered, and she's alone. Still think she deserves to be beaten or killed over some bread." The crowd was starting to waver, but there were still some holdouts. Crawford still had his club, and his eyes were hard with hatred. "Indians killed my brother last year, tortured him before they did it. Why should we show mercy to one of them?" "Because she's not one of them," Jake replied, his voice growing harder. "She's a child. And if you can't see the difference, then you're no better than the ones who killed your brother." The words hit home, and Crawford's face flushed with anger. "You calling me a savage, McKenna?" "I'm saying that right now. You're acting like one." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could see the crowd was split. Some were backing down, ashamed of their actions, while others were getting angrier. It was a dangerous moment, the kind that could explode into violence without warning. Jake made his decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, flipping it to Morrison. "There. That should more than cover the cost of whatever bread she might have taken. Problem solved." Morrison caught the coin, looking at it uncertainly. "This isn't about the money, McKenna. It's about a hungry child and a piece of bread," Jake interrupted. "Nothing more, nothing less. And now it's paid for. So unless you want to tell me that you're the kind of man who'd beat a child even after she's paid for what she took, I suggest you all go about your business." The crowd was deflating now, the righteous anger fading in the face of Jake's calm logic. Men were starting to drift away, suddenly finding other things that needed their attention. But Crawford wasn't done yet. "This is a mistake, McKenna," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're protecting our enemies. That makes you a traitor to your own kind." Jake's eyes went flat and cold. "My kind are people who protect children from bullies. What kind are you?" Crawford's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and Jake tensed, ready to draw. But the man thought better of it, perhaps realizing that Jake had the look of someone who'd been in more gunfights than he cared to remember. Instead, he spat in the dirt and stalked away, muttering curses under his breath. The rest of the crowd dispersed, some shamefaced, others grumbling about the state of the world. Soon only Jake and Little Bird remained in the dusty street in front of the general store. Jake looked down at the girl, who was still pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her face. "It's all right now," he said gently. "They're gone." Little Bird looked up at him with eyes full of gratitude and confusion. "Why did you help me?" Jake considered the question. Why had he helped her? Because she was a child? Because she was alone and afraid? Because he'd seen too much cruelty in his life and was tired of it? All of those reasons were true, but there was something more. something he couldn't quite put into words. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. Jake's cabin was small and sparse, containing only the essentials a drifting man needed: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace that served for both warmth and cooking. The walls were bare except for a single window that looked out toward the mountains, and his few possessions were neatly arranged with the precision of a man accustomed to traveling light. But it was clean and safe, and right now, that was all that mattered. Little Bird stood in the doorway, her dark eyes taking in everything with the wariness of a wild animal. She'd stopped crying, but Jake could see the tension in her small frame, the way she held herself ready to run at the first sign of danger. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of soldiers after their first battle, the look of someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. "It's not much," Jake said, lighting the oil lamp on the table, "but it's warm and dry. You can rest here." Little Bird nodded but didn't move from the doorway. "You live here alone?" "I do. Have for about 3 months now." Jake moved to the small pantry and began pulling out what food he had: some dried beef, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, and a few apples. "Not much of a cook, I'm afraid, but this should fill your belly." He set the food on the table and gestured for her to sit. Little Bird approached cautiously, as if expecting a trap, but hunger eventually overcame her wariness. She sat down and began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her body reminded her of how long it had been since her last meal. Jake watched her eat, his heart aching for what this child had endured. She was trying to maintain her dignity, eating carefully and quietly, but he could see the desperate hunger in the way she held the bread, as if someone might snatch it away at any moment. "Take your time," he said gently. "There's plenty, and no one's going to take it from you." Little Bird looked up at him, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. "In my village, we always shared food. No one went hungry if there was food to be had." "Sounds like a good way to live," Jake said, settling into the chair across from her. "Tell me about your village." Little Bird's eyes grew distant. "It was by the river where the cottonwoods grow tall. My father is the chief. Chief Standing Bear. He says the white man's name for our people is Lakota, but we call ourselves Lakota. We are the people of the 7 Fires." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard of Standing Bear. Most people in this part of the territory had. The Lakota chief was known as a fierce warrior and a cunning strategist, but also as a man of honor who kept his word. If this girl was his daughter, then the situation was far more complicated than Jake had realized. "Your father is Chief Standing Bear?" Jake asked carefully. Little Bird nodded, pride evident in her voice despite her circumstances. "He is a great leader. He has never been defeated in battle. He says the earth is our mother, and we must protect her from those who would harm her." Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Standing Bear's daughter was here, alone and separated from her people, then something terrible must have happened. The chief was legendary for his protective nature, especially when it came to his family. He would never have let his daughter out of his sight unless he'd had no choice. "Little Bird," Jake said carefully, "the soldiers who attacked your village, do you know who they were, what they looked like?" The girl's face darkened. "They wore blue coats. Their leader had yellow hair and cruel eyes. He spoke our language, but his words were full of hatred. He said we had broken the treaty, that we had raided the white settlements, but we had not. We were hunting buffalo, as the treaty allowed." Jake's jaw tightened. It sounded like Colonel Marcus Kane, a man with a reputation for brutality and a pathological hatred of Native Americans. Kane had been pushing for a final solution to the Indian problem for years, and he wasn't particular about which tribes he targeted or why. "This man with the yellow hair," Jake said. "Did he have a scar on his left cheek?" Little Bird's eyes widened. "Yes. How did you know?" "I've met him before." Jake's voice was grim. "His name is Colonel Kane. He's not a good man, Little Bird. He's hurt a lot of people, both Indian and white." Little Bird set down her bread, her appetite suddenly gone. "My mother said that some white men were good and some were bad, just like our people. She said I should judge each person by their actions, not by the color of their skin. But after what I saw—" "Your mother was right," Jake said firmly. "There are good people and bad people in every group. What Colonel Kane did to your village doesn't represent all white people, just like what some warriors might do doesn't represent all of your people." Little Bird studied his face for a long moment. "You are different from the men in the town. They looked at me and saw an enemy. You look at me and see a person. That's because you are a person," Jake replied. "A young person who's been through something terrible and needs help. That's all I need to know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jake found himself thinking about the mob earlier, about the hatred and fear in their eyes. As the night deepened, Jake set up a bedroll near the fire for Little Bird. She curled up in the blankets, looking small and vulnerable in the flickering light. Jake sat in his chair, cleaning his rifle, and thinking about what tomorrow might bring. He'd made powerful enemies today. Crawford and his friends wouldn't forget this incident, and they'd be looking for ways to make him pay. But Jake had faced worse odds before and survived. What worried him more was what would happen to Little Bird if her father didn't come for her. "Jake?" Little Bird's voice was drowsy but clear. "Yes? Thank you for helping me, for giving me food and shelter, for seeing me as a person." Jake looked at her, this brave little girl who'd lost everything but still had hope. "You don't need to thank me, Little Bird. We take care of each other. That's what people do." "Not all people," she murmured, her eyes closing. "But the good ones do." Jake watched her fall asleep, her breathing evening out as exhaustion finally claimed her. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the flames dance in the fireplace. Jake settled back in his chair, his rifle across his knees, and prepared to keep watch through the night. He had a feeling that tomorrow would bring changes, and he wanted to be ready for whatever came. Jake woke to the sound of drumming. At first, he thought it was thunder rolling across the prairie, but as consciousness fully returned, he realized the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. He'd heard drums like these before, during his time in the cavalry years ago, and the memory sent a chill down his spine. War drums. But these weren't calling for battle. They were announcing a presence, a formal declaration that someone important had arrived. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the cabin's single window, and Jake could see Little Bird sitting up in her bedroll, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She'd heard the drums too, and she knew what they meant. "Is it?" she whispered. "I think so," Jake replied, moving to the window. What he saw in the growing light made his blood run cold. The hills surrounding Broken Ridge were no longer empty. Like shadows materializing from the earth itself, warriors had appeared on every ridge, every hilltop, every vantage point that overlooked the town. They sat motionless on their horses, silhouetted against the lightening sky, their presence as undeniable as the dawn itself. Jake had seen military formations before, but this was something different. This wasn't an army. It was a nation on the move. He could make out the distinctive war paint and regalia of the Lakota, their lances and rifles glinting in the early morning light. And there were so many of them. It looked like 500 warriors had surrounded the town during the night. "My father," Little Bird breathed, scrambling to her feet and running to the window. "He came for me." Jake felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that Little Bird would be reunited with her family, but terror at what this meant for the town. 500 warriors surrounding a settlement of maybe 300 people, including women and children. If things went wrong, it would be a massacre. The drumming stopped, and in the sudden silence, Jake could hear the sounds of panic beginning to ripple through the town. Doors slamming, voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet on wooden walkways. Someone was ringing the town's bell, the signal for all men to gather with their weapons. "Little Bird," Jake said carefully, "I need you to stay here. Don't go outside no matter what happens, do you understand?" She nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the hills. "Will you go to them? Will you tell them I'm safe?" "I'll try," Jake said, checking his weapons. "But first I need to make sure the town doesn't do anything stupid." He stepped outside into the cool morning air and immediately saw the chaos that was engulfing Broken Ridge. Men were running through the streets with rifles, women were herding children into cellars, and the general atmosphere was one of barely controlled panic. Mayor Samuel Garrett, a portly man in his 50s, who'd made his fortune in mining supplies, was standing in the middle of the main street, trying to organize the town's defenses. His face was red with exertion and fear, and his voice cracked as he shouted orders. "Every man with a rifle, get to the church. Women and children, get to the cellars. This is it, boys, they've finally come for us." Jake pushed through the crowd, his presence causing men to step aside automatically. "Mayor Garrett." The mayor turned, his eyes wild with panic. "McKenna, thank God you're here. We're going to need every gun we can get. How many do you count?" "Too many," Jake said grimly. "But maybe we don't need to fight them." Garrett stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Are you insane? There are hundreds of them. They're going to kill every man, woman, and child in this town." "Maybe not," Jake said. "Maybe they're here for something else." Before Garrett could respond, a new sound cut through the morning air, the sound of a single horse approaching at a steady trot. The crowd fell silent, every eye turning toward the sound. Down the main street, a lone rider was approaching under a white flag of truce. The rider was a Lakota warrior, tall and proud, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. He wore traditional war paint and regalia, but his weapons were peace-bonded, and the white flag he carried was clearly visible. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the morning air, his English accented but precise. "I am Swift Eagle, war chief of the Lakota Nation. I come under the sacred flag of truce to speak with your leaders. I bring words from Chief Standing Bear." Mayor Garrett stepped forward nervously, flanked by several armed men. "I'm the mayor of this town. What do you want?" Swift Eagle's eyes swept over the crowd, and Jake felt a chill when the warrior's gaze lingered on him for a moment. "Chief Standing Bear's daughter, Little Bird, was taken from her people. We have tracked her to this place. We come to bring her home." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the men were shifting nervously, their weapons ready. Jake could see the situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the morning would explode into violence. "We don't know anything about any Indian girl," Garrett lied, his voice shaking. "There are no Indians in this town." Swift Eagle's expression didn't change, but Jake could see the warrior's hand move slightly toward his tomahawk. "You speak with a forked tongue, white man. We know she is here." The lie was exposed, and Garrett's face flushed red. Crawford stepped forward from the crowd, his rifle ready and his face hard with hatred. "So what if she is?" Crawford shouted. "She's a thief. We caught her stealing from our stores." "That's enough." Jake's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. He stepped forward, moving between Crawford and Swift Eagle. "There's no need for this to get ugly." Swift Eagle studied Jake with interest. "You are the one called McKenna, the one who protected Little Bird from the mob." Jake felt every eye in the crowd turn to him. "The girl is safe. She's been fed and sheltered. She hasn't been harmed." Swift Eagle nodded slowly. "Chief Standing Bear will remember this kindness, but she must come home now. Her people need her." "Of course," Jake said. "I'll go get her." He returned to his cabin where Little Bird was waiting, her face bright with excitement. She gathered her few possessions, and together they walked back to the main street. When Swift Eagle saw her, his stern expression softened. "Little Bird, daughter of Standing Bear, your father has been searching for you." "I knew he would come," Little Bird said proudly. "I never doubted it." She hugged Jake tightly. "Thank you for everything. I will never forget you." As Swift Eagle prepared to leave with Little Bird, he looked down at Jake one last time. "Chief Standing Bear does not forget his debts. You have earned the friendship of the Lakota Nation." With that, they rode out of town, heading toward the hills where 500 warriors waited. Jake watched them go, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. But as the crowd began to disperse, he realized his troubles were just beginning. The hatred in their eyes told him everything he needed to know about his future in Broken Ridge. 2 weeks had passed since Jake McKenna left Broken Ridge with nothing but his horse, his weapons, and the clothes on his back. He'd been drifting south, following the cattle trails and avoiding the larger settlements, where word of his betrayal might have preceded him. The frontier was a small world in many ways, and news traveled fast among the scattered communities. He'd spent the previous night camped by a small stream about 20 miles from the town of Cedar Falls, Montana Territory. The morning was crisp and clear, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Jake was saddling his horse when he heard the sound of approaching riders, many riders moving at a steady pace. His hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he relaxed when he saw the white flag carried by the lead rider. A delegation was approaching under the flag of truce, and Jake recognized the tall, proud figure of Swift Eagle at the head of the group. Behind the war chief rode a man Jake had never seen before, but who he knew immediately from Little Bird's descriptions. Chief Standing Bear was an imposing figure, perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of a man born to command. His face was weathered by years of sun and wind, marked by the lines of both laughter and sorrow. He wore traditional regalia, but it was the intelligence in his dark eyes and the strength in his bearing that truly set him apart. Little Bird rode beside her father, her face bright with joy and health. She looked like a different child from the frightened, hungry girl Jake had found 2 weeks ago. She was home where she belonged, surrounded by family and love. The delegation stopped a respectful distance from Jake's camp, and Chief Standing Bear dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age. Little Bird slid down from her horse and ran to Jake, throwing her arms around his waist. "Jake, I knew we would find you." Jake hugged her back, amazed at how much she'd changed in such a short time. "Little Bird, you look wonderful. Your father's been taking good care of you." Chief Standing Bear approached, his movements deliberate and dignified. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, carrying the weight of authority and wisdom. "Jake McKenna, I am Standing Bear, chief of the Lakota Nation. My daughter tells me that you saved her life." Jake felt suddenly awkward in the presence of this legendary figure. "I just did what any decent person would do, Chief. She needed help." Standing Bear studied him with those intelligent eyes. "Swift Eagle tells me that you stood between my daughter and an angry mob, that you fed her and sheltered her, asking nothing in return, that you gave up your place in that town to protect her. This is not what any decent person would do. This is what a man of great courage and honor would do. I couldn't let them hurt her," Jake said simply. "She was just a child." "She was my child," Standing Bear said, his voice thick with emotion. "My youngest daughter, the light of my life. When the soldiers attacked our village, I thought I had lost her forever." Little Bird moved to stand beside her father, her hand slipping into his. "I told him everything, Jake. How you stood up to the angry men, how you gave me food and shelter, how you protected me even when it made the townspeople angry at you." Standing Bear nodded. "My daughter also tells me that you lost your home because of your kindness to her, that the people of that town cast you out because you showed mercy to a Lakota child." The chief gestured to one of his warriors, who brought forward a magnificent horse, a black stallion with white markings, clearly one of the finest animals Jake had ever seen. "This is Windwalker, son of my own war horse. He is swift as the wind and strong as the mountain. He is yours." Jake stared at the horse in amazement. "Chief, I can't accept this. It's too much." "You can, and you will," Standing Bear said with the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "But that is not all. My daughter tells me that you are a man without a home, without a people. This troubles me greatly, for a man needs both to be truly whole." Little Bird stepped forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "My father wants to invite you to join our tribe, to become one of us." Jake felt his heart stop. What?" Standing Bear smiled for the first time since arriving. "It is not an offer I make lightly, Jake McKenna. You have shown yourself to be a man of honor, courage, and compassion. These are the qualities we value most in our people. You would be welcome among us." Jake looked around at the assembled warriors, seeing acceptance and respect in their faces. These were men who had been his enemies just weeks ago, according to the stories told in towns like Broken Ridge. But now they were offering him something he'd never expected: a home, a family, a place where he belonged. "I'm honored by the offer," Jake said slowly, "but I don't know if I could fit in. I'm not Lakota. I don't know your ways, your customs." "You know the most important thing," Standing Bear replied. "You know what it means to protect the innocent. You know what it means to stand up for what is right, even when it costs you everything. These are the foundations of our way of life." Little Bird took Jake's hand. "Please, Jake, I want you to be part of our family. My father says that family is not just about blood, it's about the people who stand by you when the world turns dark." Jake felt tears prick his eyes. For so many years he'd been drifting, moving from place to place without roots or connections. He'd convinced himself that he preferred it that way, that he was better off alone. But looking at these people, this family, he realized how empty his life had been. "All right," he said finally. "If you'll have me, I'd be honored to join your people." Little Bird let out a whoop of joy and hugged him tightly. Standing Bear smiled broadly and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Welcome to the Lakota Nation, Jake McKenna. You are no longer a man without a home. Swift Eagle stepped forward with a beaded necklace in his hands. "This is the mark of our brotherhood," he said, placing it around Jake's neck. "Wear it with pride, for you have earned it through your actions." As Jake looked around at the faces of his new family, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense of belonging, of purpose, of hope for the future. He thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment, about the choices he'd made and the prices he'd paid. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the distance, Jake could see the Lakota camp, with its proud teepees and the smoke of cooking fires rising into the evening air. It looked like home. As they rode toward the camp, Little Bird riding beside him on her pony, Jake thought about the future. There would be challenges ahead, the coming conflicts, the struggle to bridge two worlds, the difficult task of building understanding between peoples who had been enemies for so long. But for the first time in his life, Jake McKenna felt ready to face whatever came next. He was no longer a drifter, no longer a man without roots or purpose. He was part of something larger than himself, something worth fighting for. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake smiled and urged his new horse forward, toward home, toward family, toward a future filled with hope and possibility. The sound of drums echoed across the prairie, but these were not war drums. These were the drums of celebration, of welcome, of a new beginning. Jake McKenna had found his place in the world at last, and it was exactly where he belonged.